Consider this a professional courtesy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name is Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker, licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. I hope all's going well for everyone out there. The market continues to be nuts, particularly if you're a buyer. What's nuts is that buyers are out there buying, and so many sellers are still holding on to their properties. You'd think with the high point we're seeing in property values that a lot of sellers will be looking to liquidate, but we're just not seeing it. Lots of theories running around as to why. Here on the show, it's been uncertainty, I think, has been what we've come down on. In the coming months, I think we'll see more and more interesting news that comes out relating to that kind of stuff. We're just not getting the new homes. You know, that sort of just sets the stage, right? We're not getting the new homes we really need. We're not seeing sellers or current owners putting their homes on the market, but we're still seeing those buyers coming out in droves. It's a bad time for buyers. Today, we're going to talk about housing costs. I think that's one of the big things that's going to play into any kind of shift. I mean, what's the only variable left, right? We're going to talk about that simply because we're not seeming to get motion on these other things. Now, before we do, let's talk about how to get in touch with me. The absolute best ways to do it are through the websites. Just head on over to www.therebelbroker.com. From there, you can send along any ideas, suggestions, observations, or questions that might be bouncing around in your head. Happy to reply. And of course, if you would like to join the Rebel Underground, there will be links on the page for that as well. I believe there's one just below the player, right there, a button to join the Rebel Underground. Feel free to do that if you'd like to get some insights outside of just the show. If you want to kind of get that next level of involvement with me, please go ahead and click there and provide the information necessary so that I can reach out to you with new and exciting information and occasionally some exclusive material. I want to give you more, ground truth stuff. I usually like to try to start the show off with any new and exciting revelations. Really nothing that goes outside of my local marketplace. I realize that markets are different all across the country. We talk about things on this show, and sadly, we end up talking about either the stuff I'm having firsthand experience with, which tends to be the southern Silicon Valley area, or we end up talking about things that are national trends. Well, of course, none of those things equal what's going on with Kansas City, or and unless I'm talking about those areas specifically, we don't cover that. So it's always important to try to draw from what we talk about information that's valuable to you in your local marketplace, things you might want to look for. In other words, if we're talking about crazy housing costs, and that's an element of your decision-making process, you're going to want to make sure that that's true for your local market as well. I occasionally will get listeners reaching out to me and saying, well, that's just not happening here at all. And I'll chat back and forth about what is happening. The biggest value you can get out of this show is to draw strategies that are more universal, right? Don't take the specific of what's happening right here in my marketplace, for instance, and assume that you need to do the exact same thing in your marketplace. What you want to do is try to extract the theory or the strategy out of it. And I try to make those obvious or try to explore those a little bit, because obviously the goal is to make this as valuable to as large a number of people as possible. So we'll try to do that as well here. This is an article that's coming to us from Realtor Magazine. Housing costs up 9% for entry-level buyers. And of course, that far outstrips any kind of income increases over the same period of time. It's absolutely ridiculous, and this just piles on with everything else. Now, we're going to go ahead and cover a few metro areas and talk about the increases. And what's interesting here is decisions you can make based on this. Now, let me give you an example. So as I've been telling folks for a while, I've been following the rental market here in my area for quite some time. And it's really super easy to do. It's something I suggest you do. If you're an investor who is considering renting yourself, if you're someone who already has a rental, no matter what you're doing in your marketplace, understanding what's going on with the rental markets out there is very important. It'll help you it'll help you get a much earlier view of what direction rents are going in, right? You can gauge that by how many days a property was on the market. Now, what I'll do is in Trulia, I will simply save or favorite a whole bunch of different properties. And as soon as those things go off of rental for Trulia, I get an email that tells me that. So in my spreadsheet, I can have the address, I can have the rent that's being asked for, I can have the day that I saw it go on to Trulia, and I don't have to catch it the day it goes on, because when you look at those listings in Trulia, it'll tell you how many days it's been on Trulia for rent, and then I can put in the day that it went off of Trulia. And usually there's a contact provided with those. I mean, if a phone number is obviously the best way, but for every one of them, right, because they want people to reach out to them and contact them, there's at least an email address, or not an email address, but a button to contact them. And I'll usually reach out and ask if that property has rented, if it's still available. And if they respond yes, great, then I know for a fact that it rented. So I've been compiling this data for a while. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this year, there was a really dramatic change in rental rates. Really, things jumped by about $300 to $500 across the board in my local marketplace, which is very bizarre because rental rates remained relatively flat and didn't go up quite as much in, say, San Jose, South San Jose, as they did in Morgan Hill. And that's primarily because of the way the market is. There's just fewer homes for rent in Morgan Hill. And what's bizarre is I can more cheaply rent a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in in San Jose than I can in Morgan Hill. Which, from a market standpoint, understanding that Morgan Hill is more of a bedroom community for San Jose is pretty nuts, right? But it shows you what folks are drawn to. Morgan Hill, the homes tend to have a little bit more room. The lots tend to be bigger. And Morgan Hill's sort of outside the urban crush and sprawl of Silicon Valley. So that's the draw of Morgan Hill. Now, why do you care about these things? If you are someone who's been so let's take it from two perspectives. The first perspective is going to be the person who owns property and has been considering renting. Now, that person obviously has acquired their property at a cheaper price. Even if you bought it at the peak last time, property values are now to the point where you would be definitely positive cash or walk away with money above and beyond what you paid for the property if you were to sell it today. Even if you had a 100% loan, right, that you were still somehow magically carrying it at 100%. So the reason why I bring this up is as property values go up, it makes it more and more difficult for folks to conventionally purchase a home and turn it into a profitable rental, right? You have to have, because you're not seeing rents keeping up with home prices, you need to put down more and more in order for it to flow. And then that affects your utility of your money, right? That's return on investment. We've talked about this before. If you've got $100,000 into a property and it's making you $1,000 a month, well, that's not bad. That's actually pretty good. That's $12,000 a year, and if we assume all the other expenses have been accounted for, that's not bad. That's pretty good, right? Well, if you purchase a home and you've got $100,000 into it, but you can't rent it for an amount that would give you that kind of return on investment. Let's say you were only making, after you've paid the mortgage and everything else, all the expenses associated with it, you're only making $200 per month. Well, that's the utility of your money, right? And you can sort of get a feel for that. And that's one reason why you want to understand the return on investment in other places, right? And this is the argument I've made before. You're much better off selling your $1 million home in the Silicon Valley and renting in the Silicon Valley, and then taking that $1 million and investing it in, say, let's say you picked 2 or 3 markets you felt good about that made it to our list of top return on investment areas. And let's say you bought 8 properties. If on average, each one of those properties is making you $500, right? That's not bad. 8 times 5 gives us $4,000 a month. So not horrible, not fantastic given, the amount of money we're talking about, but it also helps you to diversify. So now when your renters move out and it's vacant, it's not 100% of your investment that's vacant. It's only 1/8 of your investment, right? So there's a variety of good reasons. And I would argue you'd actually make more than that. If you took that $1 million and just straight out purchased properties in a variety of different markets. My argument would be that you'd probably, on average, would actually make about $1,000 per property, which would be twice that, right? And now you're getting into an area that makes a lot more sense, and you're making a really good wage off of those things in terms of monthly income. All right. So the decision needs to be made with property values jumping in a lot of areas. If you're someone who's purchased earlier, what you find is that rents will go up, but not at the same rate as home values. So if you were to try to purchase right now, for instance, making that work means a lot more cash invested in order for it to flow. If for someone who purchased years ago, that's usually not the issue. Usually rents have increased enough that you can now think about not selling this property and instead turning it into a rental. Now, again, you want to do the utility equation. And this is the reason this is coming up is I actually had a conversation with a listener, and it was relating to a statement I made, I think kind of offhandedly a couple of shows back, where I was toying with the idea of renting my house that I've been talking about. I've had all kinds of great theories, right? I've had a variety of different plans. I've had the stay in the home, build on a lot plan, where then I move into a home that I have built, where it would actually have to be less money. I would be able to put an amount of money into it that I'd be left with a really good chunk of money I could use to invest. And even after doing that, my monthly expenditure on mortgage would actually be less than what I'm currently paying. So it's positive to my cash flow and positive to my net usable cash, which I could then invest in other properties. So that was theory number one, or plan number one. And then another one came up when I realized that rents had gone up so much in my area that I could make a little over $1,100 a month in rent on my current property. But then you have to start talking about utility. That $1,100 sounds pretty good, unless, let's pretend I owned that home outright, and let's say it was $1 million homes. Well, I have $1 million tied up in something that's only making me, say, $1,100 a month. So do the math on that, right? If you do the math and you figure out $1,100 a month, do that times 12, give yourself the total, divide that by $1 million. Well, that means I'm only making 1.3% on my money. Well, see, that's not a great thing, right? We've already talked about how that's a reflection of the utility of your money that's in the asset, right? So it sounds like a really good amount of money, but if you own the property outright, it just doesn't make much sense. You can get higher utility elsewhere. You've got areas where the return on investment is above double digits. You're above 10% in some areas with those levels of investment. So it just doesn't make sense, right? So it's a math problem you need to do. If you're someone who owns the property outright, do this kind of math. Figure, if I had this money in cash right now, could I make more as a percentage elsewhere? So that's where it comes down to. So as I mentioned at the start, as someone who owns the property, clearly you're going to be able to make money. If this is a property you owned before, you're at the point where you're going to definitely be positive cash flow. It's really just going to depend on how positive cash flow, unless you've really leveraged yourself. If you're someone who's gotten, home equity lines of credits or second mortgages, whatever you might have done, you may have really burdened yourself. But do this math. It may not make much sense if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of cash into the property, or you don't have a lot of equity, but you still could potentially rent it at a profit. Great. Those numbers might work for you, and moving to another marketplace may not make more sense. I'd argue in just about any case it would. But let's talk about the new investor. New investors I talk to are less concerned about the monthly cash flow and are more convinced of the appreciation, right? Because those are the two things we want to think about as investors. Is this property going to make me money as a regular monthly payoff kind of thing because of renters, but I'm not going to see a whole lot of appreciation? Or am I going to be able to enjoy a huge amount of appreciation, which would offset the monthly income? Now, remember, we're talking about real dollars and pretend dollars, right? Appreciation is pretend dollars. It may be real dollars once you sell the house, but you have to go through the process of selling it, right? So you need to understand which is more important for you. For instance, if you are someone who is more interested in net worth per se, perhaps you are, and you're fully convinced that wherever you are, property values are going to continue to go up at much larger clips than normal or than other areas, it may make more sense for you to ride that wave of appreciation and then make use of that appreciation through leveraging that property in other markets. Now, let's go back to my original example of saying the utility you're getting out of that money in California or in my area isn't as great as the utility you might get in someplace like Atlanta or Memphis or these other cities we've talked about with great returns. But you really don't want to get rid of this house you have in California. You're really convinced that the appreciation train is going to continue on. Well, then you would want to pull that value out in terms of refinancing a mortgage or just getting a loan based on your equity to then use that to acquire properties elsewhere. That would be a perfectly valid way to go if you want to not necessarily back out of the market because you're still convinced property values are going to go up. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit more about this, and we're going to go through some major metro areas and what changes we've seen in relating to housing costs, particularly over the last year, because I think a lot of these numbers are going to help you decide what directions you might need to go or whether you need to blend it like we just talked about. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Are you ready to jump in and start your search for your first investment property? Maybe you've decided that it's time to own your own home, or maybe you're ready to sell your home and move on to something new. No matter what your goal is, the Rebel Broker can help. That's right, aside from hosting this show, I am also the owner broker of Whitelaw & Sons Real Estate Services right here in Silicon Valley. With over 25 years experience serving Silicon Valley, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy, I or one of my great agents can help you achieve your goals in real estate. So if you're ready to look into taking that next step towards achieving your real estate goals, point your browser at www.soldbyrobert.com. That's www.soldbyrobert.com and get in touch. Let me show you how I will earn your business and your respect. Again, that's www.soldbyrobert.com, or you can call me at 408-852-0525. California Bureau of Real Estate ID 00984-909.
Welcome back, everyone. Well, at the heart of today's discussion is really housing costs and what direction they're going and how they can inform decisions, not just for home buyers, but also for investors trying to decide where things are in terms of your local marketplace to make some important decisions. And what we've talked about so far is that person who already owns, right? Maybe you've lived there for a while. Maybe you're living in your property. You're trying to make those first steps into establishing yourself as an investor. Well, what better place to start than with the home you already own and have maybe been making payments on for the last 5 or 10 years or however long you've been there. Now, we talked about the idea of understanding the utility of the money or the amount of equity you have in that home. And you can do some math to figure that out. And you would want to figure out what would it rent for. We talked about a technique I use where I keep track of homes for rent on Trulia. I track how much they rent. And what's really interesting is recently I've seen a lot of drops in rental rates. So we saw that $300 to $500 increase that I mentioned earlier this year. And now that we're heading more into the season, I'm actually seeing homes for rent that stayed on the market a while and now are dropping the monthly rent that they're asking for by about $100 in many cases. So kind of an interesting switch in that. What's interesting is that doesn't reflect what I'm seeing in terms of buyers. As I mentioned, tons and tons of buyers for properties. I just sold a property in 4 days that in any other kind of market would have taken much longer to sell for amazing terms, worked out fantastic for my seller. And that is in direct contrast to some of these properties that are beautiful properties that just are not renting for the initial amount they're asking for. And you'll want to track that as well. But in any event, the reason why you want to do that Trulia tracking is because you want to do it so that you can compare your home. So it's most important to keep track of rentals in your local market where that property is located. So you given any given time, you are aware of what you could potentially rent your home for. And if you continue to track it the way I've suggested, you're not only going to know how much you can probably rent it for, but you're also going to have a good idea of how long it would take you to get the home rented based on what you're seeing other properties performing at in terms of going off of Trulia and being rented. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some metro areas, but also understanding what someone needs to do relating to making a new purchase. If you're very investment minded, you could go into it and try to think of it that way. But the reality is if you wanted to make it positive cash flow, you'd have to put more money in. And in today's market, where the average home in some of these marketplaces is $1.2 million, but the average rent for a home this is a great example. So I went and I actually looked at a rental that was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath in Sunnyvale. I then looked up what homes of the exact same, this was actually a townhome, so this wasn't even a single-family residential home. I then looked up what homes were selling for, and I found homes for sale, exact same floor plan, exact same development, $1.1 million. Well, this place was only going to rent for $3,400. That is not a great return on investment. In fact, if we take a look at it, right, so we go with that $1.1 million and we assume we're going to have to put down at least 20%. You may not be able to put down just 20% if you're identifying this as a investment. And also, you'd probably pay a higher rate than what I'm putting in here. I went ahead and assumed 4%. But you'd be, you'd be purchasing at $1.1 million, down payment of 20%, loan amount $880,000. The total down payment would be, $220,000. Your monthly payment would be including, interest rate, including property taxes. And this is, this is actually an optimistic property tax for California. It would actually probably be a lot higher than what they're putting here. They're assuming $2,400 per year. Good luck. The odds are it would actually be, about $8,000 more than that. And then home insurance, and there was an HOA associated with that. So low estimate, the property tax rate will be way off here, but let's go with $4,834.59 would be the monthly payment. No hope of getting that in Sunnyvale. As I said, this exact same floor plan, same square footage in this same development is only renting for $3,450 is what it ended up coming down at. So you'd have to go ahead and put an awful lot more money in there before, on a month-to-month basis, this would make any sense. And the return on investment would be a very small percentage. So that's the math you want to do, right? All your holding costs. So you're going to put in what your mortgage payment is, your tax, insurance, HOAs, and also you need to put in a little bit of care and feeding in there. So understand that per year things will go wrong, and you should at least put money aside or account for putting money aside to take care of those things. So that's why things don't necessarily work here. Now, why do people do this? Why do we get investors who are actually willing to take a loss per month in some of these scenarios? Now, most of them don't. Usually the investors that I'm talking to after they've already done these sort of things at least did the math so that it's break even, and they are putting enough money into it so that the amount they're financing, along with all the other expenses, really only adds up so that they're making maybe $0 to $100 per month tops. But what they're riding is the appreciation wave. Now, folks who did this 3 years ago are doing great, right? The appreciation has gone up gigantically on some of these properties. They've made $200,000-$300,000 in the period of time they've owned it. But of course, then they start to fall into that category of someone who bought before. Now we're kind of trying to talk about people who are buying right now. What's the smart move today? And I would argue that given the sort of lay of the land, this is not a great decision to make. Buying in a local market like mine, and of course, you always kind of want to move towards that local market. You want to find places in your local market where it makes sense. And even if you're going for the worst property, you're still finding yourself in a difficult position. I think I mentioned before the story about a home that sold for nearly twice the asking price that was burnt down. You'd have to pay all cash for the property. No bank is going to finance it. So not only would you have to go in there and pay that money for it, you'd then have to build a new home, which odds are to build a typically sized home is going to cost you what? Let's go cheap. $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 to build a new home in that area. So it's not a math friendly conclusion we come to in terms of where's the smart place to put your money when it comes to real estate. Now, blend all of that with this idea that the market is going to dip or flatten, perhaps for a very long time. I think most folks you talk to, at the very least, are anticipating a period of stagnation, if not a period of drop in property values. But let's take a look and see how things have grown, how much things have gone nuts here. I'm just going to go ahead and start at the top. I'm not gonna do sort of a countdown here. But this is an interesting one. I'll put a link to this article in the show notes for today's show, so feel free to head on over to therebelbroker.com and check those out. Now, let's first talk about the average. This is the 133 market roll-up. Monthly housing costs on average in the United States are $1,641 with a one-year increase of $136 per month, right? That's the monthly cost increase. That's a 9% one-year increase from the same time last year. So your housing costs have gone up 9%. My understanding with the last numbers I saw is, on average, folks, the household incomes only went up 1 point something percent. Isn't that all we saw over the last year? Now, the Bay Area tops out the list. This is where I am. Monthly housing costs are $4,673. 1 year increase, $584. That's a 14% increase. That's the highest number in the country. And of course, this is the San Francisco and San Jose metro areas. So it extends over a pretty large area. Probably my area of Morgan Hill doesn't quite make it into that, but I'm the very first city just south of San Jose. Next on the list is Seattle with a monthly housing cost of $2,790 per month with a 1 year increase of $314. And that's a 13% increase year to year. Then Las Vegas is next. $1,248 monthly housing cost. Now, this is interesting because you heard the number I said for the average across the country, right? 1,641. So Las Vegas, despite the fact it's third on the list, is not even above the U.S. average. And it saw a 1 year increase of 134. So and that too is below the average of 136 for 1 year. But it was a 12% increase. So in terms of rate of increase, Las Vegas is going nuts, right? I mean, it may not, it's in terms of the velocity or how steep that curve is, Las Vegas is really kind of knocking it out of the park. We already had crazy levels in these other areas like Seattle and California or in the Bay Area. But Las Vegas is sort of an interesting one in that mix. Now, Nashville is next. Nashville has shown up on our list for a ton of reasons. Now, and there's sexiness about Nashville. One is their monthly housing costs are $1,318, which is $300 more than $300 below the average for the country. The 1 year increase was $113, but their 1 year percentage increase was 9%. And they're number 4 on our list. Now, remember, we've talked about Nashville before. Nashville also has a great return on investment number. And we're seeing numbers here that I think still make it a reasonable point to go in there and consider making Nashville a destination for your investments. Now, remember, we've also have had guests on in the past that are super excited about Tennessee in general for investing. And I believe we had one person on who actually has investments in Nashville. Now, next is Salt Lake City. Now, this is our first city that kind of comes in general in a weird place as compared to the average. Salt Lake City had $1,660 as the monthly housing cost, which is over the national average, but it had a 1 year increase of $131, which is below the national average, for a total of a 9% 1 year increase. I think Salt Lake City is interesting. I've never taken a close look at Salt Lake City numbers. It's one folks have talked about. But let's go ahead and hit some of the other cities that have topped our list of destination cities in terms of return on investment. Whenever we've had chats or covered articles, I like to sort of bring these communities back up. Now, we're going to skip down the list a little bit. Dallas has been on our list before. $1,835 is the monthly housing cost there. That was a $134 increase year to year, and that was an 8% increase from the previous year. Next, Charlotte, North Carolina is one that has been on our list before. The monthly housing costs on average are $1,234. Now, remember, let's also understand what average is, right? Monthly housing cost. It's those bread and butter properties, right? Where you're typically talking about 3-bedroom, 2-bath being in that sweet spot. And of course, there's going to be variation with that. And there's going to be variation not only within that number in general for Nashville, but then the various sub areas within Nashville. Remember, it's always about and Charlotte, for instance, it's always about those sub markets and the desirability for making them a rental. Okay, we talked about Dallas. Another one was Charlotte. I think we talked about $1,234 monthly housing, $87 increase from last year with a 8% year-over-year rate increase. San Diego's on the list at $2,980 per month. It's actually a big one in terms of, in general, being below the U.S. average in terms of percentage, but being super high in the month to month. That was $197 1 year increase and a 7% rate increase over the year, which might indicate a slowing market there. Next, we go to Sacramento. $1,904 was the monthly housing cost average with a $121 increase, which was a 7% rate increase. Let's see here. Phoenix is another market I like to talk about. $1,228 is the monthly housing cost for that area. $70 1 year increase. That was a 6% increase there. Now, so why do we care about? There's tons more on here. I'm going to suggest you go ahead and follow the link to this and see what metro area might fit your goals. If you have any of these that you're interested in, it'll be interesting to understand the rate of change, right? Now, there's one on this list, actually two, that I think are kind of interesting because they're at the bottom of the list in terms of rate of increase. And what's particularly interesting is these are communities that were both at the top of lists like this a couple of years ago. So the lowest on this, Washington, D.C., monthly housing costs, $2,210. 1 year increase, $21. It was a 1% year-over-year increase in the Washington, D.C. area. I think that's super interesting because remember, when a lot of us were languishing right after the downturn, Washington, D.C. was going nuts, and Washington, D.C. was at the top of a lot of these lists. Now, what else can we draw in terms of good data from this? And we can talk about Washington, D.C., but we can talk about any of these. If you are in one of these areas, if you own investment properties in any of these areas, this could be another one of those little alarm bells you might want to listen to in terms of finding. And if you're someone if you're a buy and hold person and just say, I'm a holder, man, unless I understand something horrible is going to happen in this community, I stick. I like the monthly cash flow. Great. But if not, if you are someone who kind of wants to get out of a market when has peaked and then you want to buy into another market that's likely to grow, I would suggest that some of the areas that are at the bottom of this list, the Washington, D.C.s, the New Yorks, the Philadelphias, the Houstons, the Chicagos, it may be time, and you need to use your local market understanding, right? Because for some of these areas, this is a peak, right? These were numbers that were bigger in previous months, but have gotten smaller in this month. And you need to understand that relationship because this could either be a peak or could be the beginning of an amazing growth period. But we all know from past knowledge, Washington, D.C. is last on this list. New York is second to last. And we know that those are two cities that were huge in terms of this kind of growth not that long ago. So these are areas where you might want to say to yourself, the utility of my money, the continued benefit I draw from the money I have invested is maybe not served here. And if you are looking at this from the standpoint of being able to grow your rents, let's say you're someone who bought into one of these markets and you maybe bought in at a point that was late in the process and you were banking on a certain level of increase for you to get a reasonable return on your investment relating to housing costs, how much you could raise the rent. Be aware in these areas, you're probably not going to be able to increase those rents over the next year. If this is an indicator of a flattening in an area like Washington, D.C., and you've been renting, and let's say you've got a home that kind of falls into that average monthly cost where you've been charging a rent of $2,200, you're not probably going to be able to raise that rent next year or the year after because these are areas that look like things are slowing down. New York's marketplace can be a little bit more volatile. But again, this is one where the monthly housing costs $2,600 a month with only a 4% change from last year. The rate at which you're going to be able to increase rents is likely to be challenging if you're someone who bought late and was really thinking this number was going to help pad your future rents. So good data here for you to assess, do I want to get into this market? Is it time for me to get out of this market? If I'm still comfortable with this market just because it is what it is, and I'm fine with that, even if it stagnates, I'm at positive cash flow enough, and I'm not worried about it declining. I would rather have it grow, but if it's stagnated for a period of time, I don't have a problem with that. Then this is data that you can still use to determine if you maybe even want to invest more in your marketplace. All right. I hope that's been valuable, folks. Again, take a look at these numbers over at therebelbroker.com. I'll have a link to the chart here. Plus, there will be a link within that article to the data itself if you want to check it out. get a better handle on what's going on, and maybe see if some of these areas, and I'll go down the list just so you don't have to go to the list. I'll just read off the metros that are covered, and then you can go to it and pick the one that's most relevant to you and check it out. So we already talked about the Bay Area, California, Seattle, Las Vegas, Nashville, Salt Lake City, Tampa, Dallas, Jacksonville, Charlotte, San Diego, Orlando, Sacramento, Riverside, San Bernardino, Atlanta, Miami, Los Angeles, Denver, Phoenix, Boston, Portland, Indianapolis, Raleigh-Durham, San Antonio, Orange County, Austin, Minneapolis, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, D.C. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. As always, the goal is to leave you with more knowledge knocking around in your head than when we started. Hopefully, we have accomplished that, and I hope the time invested in listening to the show has been worth it for you today. Thanks again for listening, everyone. We'll catch y'all next time.